He bet $150,000 that no one could translate a scrap of Basque. Then the woman with a mop read his inheritance line by line before 5 p.m., igniting a boardroom purge, an FBI knock, a courtroom reckoning, and a rooftop vow that rewrote power and love. If sharp, high-stakes family drama is your thing, stay with us. Hit like and subscribe to Not So Perfect Family 365 so you never miss the next twist. Rain peppered the conference room glass. The door hit the stop. Logan Griffin came in with a crumpled envelope. "You have got to be kidding me," he said, tossing damp pages across the table. "Anyone here read this?" Mariana, his assistant. "We tried 4 agencies, no one's available." "Basque," Logan scoffed. "Who still sends contracts in Basque? We import steel, not riddles." He turned. "Fine, whole month's salary to whoever translates it. 150 grand, right now." Nervous chuckles, chair legs scraped. "No hands." A voice from the back level, "I can." By the water cooler stood a woman in a pale blue uniform, sleeves rolled, a mop tucked against her hip. "Rosie." "Excuse me," Logan said. "I can translate," she repeated. "Basque." The room tilted toward the novelty. Logan gave a little bow. "Be my guest." She read, eyes moving like someone trained to skim for oxygen. "Notice of inheritance," she said. "Lourdes Garmendia died last month. Your mother's side, your sole heir to property and assets in Bilbao. Deadline to accept is today before 5 p.m. The laughter cut off. Logan's jaw worked. "Mariana," he said, "Spanish consulate now." While Mariana dialed, he felt everyone watching him. A kitchen memory surfaced, his mother over suds. "Don't talk down to people who clean up after you." He gave names, dates, stamps. "It's real," he said. His voice didn't sound like his. Rosie slid the papers back. "You'll need a signed reply and a courier. The clock isn't friendly." His joke ricocheted into him, whole month's salary. He pulled a checkbook. It felt primitive in all this glass and steel. "How much for your help?" he asked. "Exactly what you offered." A vein ticked. "You expect me to?" "I expect you to honor your word. People talk freely when they think I can't hear." "I'm good at hearing." The room inhaled. He wrote the numbers, tore the check, held it out. "Thank you," she said, taking it. No grin, just the calm of someone who already knows where every dollar will go. "Mariana," Logan said, "take MS. Rosie to my office. Computer template courier, we've got." He checked his watch, less than 2 hours. "I'll translate and finalize," Rosie said. "No fanfare, I want a desk and quiet. You'll have it." She pushed the cart toward the door. On the carpet, her bucket left a dotted trail like quotation marks. 20 minutes later, the acceptance was printed, signed, sealed. A courier jogged into the rain. Rosie returned with duplicates. She folded the check once and slid it into her pocket like a receipt. "Why Basque?" he asked. "How do you even? Not a story for this room." "Then where?" She studied his face the way you study a door you don't plan to use. "Nowhere that matters to you." "It matters," he said, hearing how thin it sounded. She angled the mop toward the cart. "Someone spilled coffee under the projector." "You earned that money," he said, softer. "And credit." "I don't need credit. I need people to stop deciding what I can't do." He almost smiled. Message received. "Okay." She paused at the door, eyes going distant, as if a radio only she could hear had clicked on, a child laughing, an airport calling last boarding. "Good luck with your aunt," she said. "And the house by the river." He blinked. It mentioned a river. "Everyone forgets the details they don't read," she said, already moving. The door shut. Logan stood by the rain-chopped window. Mariana touched his elbow. "Courier confirms pickup. We'll make the deadline." He nodded. The wind felt mislabeled, like a trophy with someone else's name. In the hall, an elevator chimed. He stepped out in time to see the blue uniform disappear into a closing car. His hand lifted, late. The doors met with a practiced sigh, and for the first time in years, the loudest man in the building had nothing to say. By noon, the rain had rinsed the skyline, but not Logan's head. He found Rosie in the service corridor, inventorying bleach pens. "MS, Monroe," he said carefully. "I owe you more than a check." "You owed Bilbao a reply. You sent it," she said, still counting. "I also owe you an apology for the circus in there. Work with us on call, translating only, real pay, real respect." She capped a bottle, then faced him. "Terms. Name them. No handsy congratulations. No parading me as a miracle maid. Access to a computer and the room before meetings. Rate by project, not pity." He lifted his hands. "Done, done, and done. I won't be a mascot. Understood?" 3 days later, a French buyer sat opposite the Griffin team. James, the senior translator, lounged with the assurance of a framed diploma. Rosie took a seat by the wall with a legal pad. The client began in quick, crisp French, asking about documentation. James smoothed the words into English. "He wants ISO certificates." Rosie's pencil paused. "He asked about origin tracking and environmental compliance," she said. not ISO. James blinked. I think I can handle. The buyer spoke again, slower, pointed. Rosie translated in a clean ribbon. He needs proof of traceability from source to port and a statement on emissions. ISO is optional, he didn't request it. The Frenchman nodded toward her. Merci, madame. Heat crept into James's neck. He adjusted his pen. As I was saying, Logan watched from the end of the table. Pride reached for quip, respect arrived first. Rosie wasn't theatrics, she was control of the room without trying to hold it. The buyer moved to pricing that hinged on a pre-2010 customs memo. James stalled. Rosie leaned forward once, not to show off but to keep the train on track. She named the memo, summarized the clause, and handed the client a precise, simple answer. The man smiled, signed the preliminary. When the door shut, James snapped his notebook. We don't usually let support staff correct the table. Rosie slid the pad into her bag. We should usually prefer accuracy. Logan stepped in. James, she was right, that's the point. James glanced at Logan, then at Rosie, and chose the safer target. Must be nice to hear so much while mopping. Rosie's face didn't change. In the hallway, Logan caught up. You were surgical. I was useful, she said. Surgery implies glory. I don't want that. I'd like you inside these meetings formally. Then put it in writing, briefs in advance, names spelled correctly on the invite, and pay as promised. You have it. She studied him. You're used to people taking whatever you give them and saying thanks. Today I learned that's not a compliment. That's a start. That night, Logan sat in his office. He opened his drawer, the envelope sat inside. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. Keep the maid in her lane. He stared until the words blurred, as if they'd been written on the inside of the window. A second buzz brought a photo. Rosie, in the meeting that afternoon, caught over a shoulder through a strip of glass. The caption was a broom emoji. He stood so fast the chair rolled back and hit the wall. His pulse went cold. Whoever sent it wasn't guessing, they'd been in the room. He called security. I want badge logs near conference B at 4, he said, and the camera outside my office pulled, tonight. Problem, Mr. Griffin. He looked at the text again, at the broom that wasn't a joke. Not yet, he said, but someone thinks they know how this ends. He rehearsed it 3 times, then tossed the script. When Logan found her labeling spray bottles in the supply room, he spoke like he was defusing a bomb. Professional thank you, he said. No speeches, no spotlight. Dinner, you saved a deal this week. Let me feed you once. Rosie didn't look up. Where? Le Bernardin's cousin in Chicago. White tablecloths. Cloth napkins, not paper. We talk work. You leave when you want. She let the silence stretch until it frayed. 2 conditions. I won't perform for your staff, and if I feel small, I'm gone. Agreed. Saturday, the dining room glowed like a jewelry case. Logan arrived in a navy suit he usually wore to investor calls. When Rosie walked in black blouse, dark jeans, flats, hair pinned back, she didn't match the room. She didn't need to. Heads turned anyway, the kind trained to sort people by cut of fabric and cost of hair. The host kept his smile glued to Logan. Mr. Griffin, a pleasure. And my guest, Logan said. Of course, the man said, not looking at her. At the table, the waiter poured water for Logan first and only remembered Rosie when she said evenly, I asked for water too. I'll see to it, he said, finally writing it down. Logan felt heat he'd once called pride but now knew was a cousin of shame. Conversation, though, found its own shoulders. Books, flights, the difference between diplomacy and trade. Rosie described a conference hall in Brussels that smelled like coffee and wet wool. Logan admitted he'd never read Borges and took the teasing like a man learning to lift with his legs. At the next table, an elegant woman brushed back her hair and brushed against Rosie's chair. Oops, she sang. What a simple blouse, are you a model? No, an actress. No. The woman's eyes flicked to Logan, then to Rosie, filed a conclusion and drifted away. He heard the whisper anyway, escort, obviously. Logan stood before his better self could vote. Ma'am, he said at her table. Woman you just assessed in under 4 seconds speaks 6 languages, corrected my team's contracts in 2, and saved this company $500,000 this week. If you need help, ask for it. If you need manners, borrow mine. Red crawled up her throat. I never. You didn't have to say it, he said. You wore it. He returned to Rosie, adrenaline ringing his ears. She watched him without moving. You didn't need to do that, she said. I did, he said. I should have done it sooner. I'm used to it. I'm not, and I'm done pretending it's air. The waiter arrived, over-apologizing in crisp whites. Rosie held the menu like a shield and then lowered it. I'll take the steak frites, she said. Medium. After dinner, they stepped into a street rinsed clean by evening. The city smelled like rain and brakes. Under a street lamp, her face softened without surrender. Thank you, she said. For dinner, for speaking up. It's the minimum. Minimum is rare, she said. He didn't plan it. The moment opened like an unguarded elevator and he stepped in. He leaned wrong and sure, a reflex, a wealthy man's clumsy math, gratitude plus light equals permission. Her palm cracked against his cheek. The sound startled both of them. "What the hell are you doing?" she said. I'm sorry, that was. You said professional, you promised me a table, not a script." Her voice didn't rise. It sharpened. "Don't turn me into a story you're writing. Rosie, I've been the plot device for other people's lessons. I'm not auditioning for yours." She stepped back. "Thank you for dinner, we're done." By the time he found words, the taillights of her old Honda had already threaded into traffic. On the sidewalk, his phone buzzed. Unknown number. Nice date, it read. Keep the maid in her lane. A photo followed. Rosie and Logan on the dance of sidewalk light. His head bent, her hand mid-swing. The angle was high, wrong shot from across the street. He looked around, but the windows were blind. Monday at 6:30 a.m., the basement smelled like lemon and wheels. Logan walked past carts and coils and found the door to the storage room propped open by a case of gloves. No Rosie. On the pegboard, taped straight and neat, a note in black marker. Basement done. Windows, 12th floor, east side. Tight schedule. He found her on 12, sleeves rolled, wiping a tall pane in long, efficient arcs. Through the glass, the city stacked itself in gray. "Rosie," he said softly. "About Saturday." "There's nothing to discuss," she said, eyes on the streak she was erasing. "You made a mistake, you apologized, I accept, we return to work. Can I make it right? You can stop trying to make it something." She wrung out the cloth, the motion precise. "This is my job, that is your floor, let the line be a line." He opened his mouth, closed it. "You're right." "I am," she said, without triumph. He held up the text on his screen. "Someone's watching you, us. Someone is always watching when they think you don't belong," she said, and moved to the next window. His phone buzzed again, a second text from the same unknown. "Lane enforcement starts Friday. Outsource solves everything." Logan stared until the words lost their edges, and for the first time since he'd inherited a house he hadn't earned, he was certain of what he could lose. On the 35th floor, the good coffee lived in a chrome urn no one admitted cost more than some intern's rent. James Morrison warmed his hands on a cup like a man considering a funeral he hadn't decided to attend. "Optics are bad," he said, glasses riding low. "She sits in more meetings than some managers." Richard Hayes folded a chart. "Clients like her, that's not the problem." "It becomes the problem," Sandra Walsh replied, setting a folder between them. HR lipstick neat, tone clinical. Access, proximity rumors. If anyone decides the CEO and a cleaner have blurred lines, we own that lawsuit. "Not a cleaner," Richard said, almost reflex. Then he caught himself. "Not just," James tapped the folder. "We outsource janitorial every 3 years anyway. Bids already on my desk from Sterling Services. Friday works." Sandra's eyes flickered. "I'll prepare separation language. No cause. Department restructure, transition to vendor." She signs a neutral reference clause. "And translation?" Richard asked. "She's covering Catalan Wednesday." "Let her finish the week," James said, easy as moving a piece on a board. "Then we make it clean." Sandra closed the folder. "Clean," she echoed, as if the word were a prayer. On 15, Rosie was detailing the same conference table where she'd once corrected a treaty clause without looking smug. Lemon oil. Small circles, the kind of care you give only to things you don't own. She checked the time. Noah's therapy ran at 4. He liked to watch the metronome blink and called the clicking robot rain. A memory ghosted her, the consulate in Barcelona, windows open to a street violinist, people speaking in halves of other people's languages and trusting her to make them whole. Then Meridian, the cold conference rooms, the emails that smelled like bleach when you read them twice. Then Chicago. Then the mop. Sandra appeared in the doorway like a shape cut out of a brochure. "Rosie," she said softly, "do you have a minute?" Rosie wiped one last crescent until the wood drank the shine, then set the cloth down. "Of course, Ms. Walsh." They went to a small room with 2 chairs and a fern that had seen better haircuts. Sandra folded her hands the way people do when they plan to hand you something you can't safely carry. "The company is restructuring," she said. "We're transitioning facilities to a third-party vendor. Your role is affected." Rosie waited. "This isn't about performance, you've been exemplary." Sandra slid a paper forward. "Friday will be your last day on payroll. Sterling Services will be here Monday. You can apply with them, they'll likely take you." Rosie scanned the words out of habit, left to right to left, testing for traps. There were always traps. Neutral reference clause, Cobra, accrued PTO payout, badge return. Her heart did not speed up. It did not slow down. "And the translation projects?" she asked. "Also under review." Which meant someone above her was afraid of someone above him, which meant danger that didn't show up on paper. "Thank you for telling me yourself," Rosie said. "Rosie," Sandra let the name fall flat. "This isn't personal." "It never is," Rosie said, a smile close enough to be mistaken for one. She signed where the sticky flags asked her to. The pen was heavy. The kind companies give executives for anniversaries. Logan found out by tripping over the paper. Literally, Mariana's office door was ajar, and a stack of HR forms sat like a white flag on the edge of her desk. He recognized the name on top before he knew he'd reached for it. "Why is this on your desk?" he asked. Mariana flinched. "Mr. Griffin, why is Rosalie Monroe's separation paperwork?" "Restructuring," she said quickly. "Cleaning department outsourcing." "Who approved that?" "Board." He didn't remember taking the hall in wide, angry strides. He only remembered the door, the way it hit the wall like a gavel. "Meeting," James said without looking up. "Not anymore," Logan answered. He slapped the paperwork down in front of them. "Explain this." Richard's mouth flexed. "It's administrative." "Administrative is ordering staples," Logan said. "Firing a specific employee is not an administrative errand." "We're transitioning a department," James replied. "Cheaper, cleaner, fewer headaches. We've been talking about it for months." "You chose this week," Logan said, "because you believe you're solving a different problem." Sandra kept her eyes on the paper. "We're managing risk." "You're managing your ego," he said. "A woman you expected to be invisible keeps getting seen and it's hurting your posture." James's tone cooled. "Careful. Have the courtesy to say her name," Logan shot back. "She's not optics, she's Rosie." Silence snapped taut between them. "Even if we concede your point about her competence," James said at last, "there are cultural concerns. Culture like accuracy, languages, dignity." Logan leaned across the table. "We're not a club, we're a company. The best person sits at the table." Richard's jaw worked. "Logan," he pointed at Sandra's file. "Reverse it." "We can't," Sandra said. "She signed." He stared. "You told her already." "It's effective Friday," Sandra replied. She accepted. He stood so fast his chair lurched like a horse. "Where is she?" "Logan," James said, "don't make a scene." "I am the scene," he said, and left them to their coffee and caution. The elevator ticked down with the patience of old money. Parking levels smelled like tires and cold air. He found her by a row of oil stains, a banker's box at her hip, the blue uniform traded for a thrift shop blouse that fit like a dare. "Rosie," he called. She turned. "Mr. Griffin, you don't have to do this." He heard the plea and hated it. "I didn't approve it, I can undo it." She lifted the box into the trunk of a Civic that had known too many Chicago winters. "No need. What does that even?" "I was going to leave anyway," she said, not unkindly. "Sometimes the only safe hallway is the one toward the exit. This is your job, it's a paycheck," she corrected. "My job is keeping Noah's world steady. Let me help." She closed the trunk and faced him. For a beat, they were just two people standing where the building exhaled. "You can't buy me safe," she said. "Not from people who need me small. This isn't pity. It's ownership," she said gently. "And I don't belong to you." His phone buzzed. He didn't look. Her eyes flicked to the screen anyway. "Another text?" she asked. He thumbed it open. A photo, Rosie in HR, pen to paper, time-stamped 15 minutes earlier. The caption, "Lane enforced. Outsource solves everything." Her mouth thinned, not surprised. "Is that?" he said. "Someone who wants to remind me I'm supposed to stay on the service elevator," she said. She unlocked the driver's door. "We're done here." "Rosie, don't follow me, Logan, please, I have to pick up my son." She slid into the seat. The engine coughed awake. He stepped back, palm up as if stopping a tide. She pulled away, the taillight a small red argument vanishing into concrete turns. The garage got very quiet. Then the phone buzzed again. New message, same unknown number. Friday was easy. "Next time we don't use paperwork." The call came mid-pitch, just as Logan was explaining lead times to a room of men who measured apologies in basis points. Mariana stepped in, pale. "School nurse on line 2, it's about Noah." Logan didn't think. He wasn't a CEO then, just a man who knew which name could unravel Rosie. 10 minutes later he was double-parked at Lincoln Elementary, lifting a limp boy whose lashes were too long for this kind of emergency. Rosie scrambled into the passenger seat, buckling without looking down. "He just folded," she said, voice thin. "He said the hallway was too loud and then the lights." "It's okay," Logan lied, one hand on the wheel, one on the horn. "Stay with him, talk." "Noah," she said, steadying. "Buddy, you're safe, count with me. 1, 2, 3. The boy murmured numbers, small as lint. By the time they hit the ER doors, he was breathing easier but listless, a puddle of boy in a too-big gown. A nurse with good shoes took him. A doctor with inked wrists said, "We'll run panels, could be meds, could be dehydrator, stay close." Waiting rooms are confessionals without booths. Rosie sat hunched, hands around a paper cup she didn't drink from. Logan took the chair beside her, close enough to catch her shiver, far enough not to steal it. "You didn't have to come," she said. "I wanted to," he said. "Also, I'm stubborn." She stared at the cabinets where tissues go to be forgotten. "There's a version of me you don't know. You keep trying to meet her in boardrooms and restaurants. She doesn't go there." "Where does she go?" "Law offices, back hallways, storage units." A breath that wasn't quite a laugh. Basements, he waited. When I say I used to translate, she said, I don't mean for cruise brochures. I worked consular circuits. Then Meridian. I signed NDAs I could recite in my sleep. I saw contracts that smelled wrong. I pulled the threads you're not supposed to pull. Money laundering, he said softly. Shells, fake invoices. Her eyes flicked to his. You know the words. I know the people who use them. I went up the ladder. Supervisor to director to VP. Stay in your lane, Rosie. They were polite until they weren't. Then the calls started. Cars on my street with the same dented fender 3 nights a week. My apartment door ajar, my computer wiped. HR said I'd fabricated emails, my own emails. They called me unstable, angry, unprofessional, the trifecta. Did you sue? I did, I lost. Evidence thrown out on handling. My witness couldn't be reached. My lawyer stopped returning calls. Meridian had better lawyers and longer arms. She folded the paper cup and unfolded it, making it into something that didn't exist before. I found out I was pregnant the week a voice told me on my voicemail to stop making up stories before the wrong person stops you. Noah's father said he didn't want to start a family under a cloud. He left before the first ultrasound. I took a job that paid in cash and didn't ask about resumes. I learned the city's supply closets by heart. He swallowed against a throat that felt borrowed. You were right and they buried you for it. Right doesn't pay copays, she said, but it pays in other currencies, like knowing who you'll be when the floor drops. He almost reached for her hand. He didn't. A doctor appeared, chart in hand. Noah's stable, she said. Looks like a reaction to a med combo. We're adjusting dosages. We'll watch him overnight. Rosie nodded so hard it looked like praying. When they were allowed in, Noah lay drowsy but awake, a plastic brontosaurus parked by his elbow. Mom, he said, the robot rain stopped. It did, she said, kissing his hair. And the sun is coming back. Noah spotted Logan and blinked. Do you work in the robot rain? Sometimes, Logan said. Today I just drive cars fast. Cool, Noah murmured, approving, and drifted. They stood by the bed rails, the hush of machines measuring time. Logan felt the strange, clean gravity that pulls you toward the center of another person's life. It was heavier than profit and lighter than fear, and he wanted more of it. Thank you, Rosie said, eyes on her son, for leaving your whatever million meeting. It was 2, he said. He's worth more. She flinched at the word worth, as if it came with a price tag and a return policy. Don't rescue me, Logan. Don't rescue us. That's not what I called for. You called. Her mouth tugged. I didn't know who else would answer, that's all. They sat until the doctor brought forms and a nurse brought a blanket and the hallway brought night. The fluorescent lights hummed. The vending machine insisted everything cost $1.75 exact change only. Logan's phone buzzed. He ignored it. It buzzed again. Rosie's buzzed too. A staccato that made both of them look down the way you look when you know the tide's about to change. Mariana, are you seeing this? He tapped the link. An article unfurled with the smugness of being first. Meridian Global's disgraced translator now works inside Griffin Imports, sources question CEO's judgment. Below, a photo, Rosie in a Griffin hallway, cropped tight, eyes up, badge visible, and a pull quote from a senior leader about maintaining professional boundaries. Rosie didn't blink. There it is, she said, voice flat. Logan read the byline. He knew the reporter. He knew the kind of calls that made this kind of story sprout at 9:17 p.m. His phone buzzed again, unknown number, old menace dressed as new, told you, lane enforced. Next stop isn't paperwork. By 7:02 a.m., the sidewalk outside Griffin Imports looked like a crime scene that had swapped police tape for camera cables. A van door slammed, a boom mic lifted, a reporter shouted Logan's name as if volume could indict. Inside, the front desk phones wouldn't stop ringing. Mariana's inbox bloomed red like a rash. 15 interview requests, 3 clients pausing pending clarification, and legal wants you in the boardroom at 9, she said, walking backwards to keep up with him. Also, Twitter is feral. What are they saying? He asked, not sure why he asked. That you hired your housekeeper, she said, choosing the word with tongs. He kept moving. Conference room, 10 minutes. I want comms drafting a statement. Single sentence. We don't make personnel decisions based on gossip. Legal will hate it. Good, they can water it down after we say it. At 8:57, he stepped into the boardroom. 5 faces, suits that fit like decisions. James Morrison didn't waste a second. We have a brand event, James said, as if naming it shrank it. You'll terminate Monroe today, issue a statement by noon, and we'll salvage what's left of Q2. No, Logan said. Logan, Richard started, palms out. No, Logan repeated. She's done nothing wrong. She's the best performer in 2 departments, and you know it. We don't sacrifice competence because people on the internet can type. This isn't the internet, James said, sliding a tablet across. This is Meridian's whisper campaign with receipts. Reporters have affidavits, NDA, the works. Lies, Logan said, from people with a reason to lie. In business, perception matters more than truth, James said. And in leadership, principle matters more than both. Logan said, we don't throw an employee overboard to make the waves applaud. Sandra's tone was therapist smooth. We're managing exposure. There's also the question of your judgment, Logan. The dinner, the closed-door meetings, you've blurred lines. My judgment is fine, he said, heat rising. Yours is cowardice wearing accounting. James took off his glasses, folded them like a small ceremony. Clause 15b. Logan went still. You're kidding. In cases where a CEO's unilateral decisions present significant risk to the company, James recited, the board may intervene. Temporary suspension. 2 weeks, full review. Richard wouldn't meet his eyes. Sandra did. It's not personal. Everything you do to someone with a name is personal, Logan said. No one answered. A pen rolled to the edge of the table and stopped, as if the room had agreed to hold its breath. James slid a single-page letter across the wood. The Griffin logo floated at the top like a dare. Effective immediately, James said. Security, Logan asked, almost amused. Are you going to walk me out? No, Richard said, finally looking at him. I'll call you a car. Logan smiled without cheer. Keep the car, I have places to be. He picked up the letter, folded it once, slipped it into his jacket. As he stood, his phone vibrated. Unknown number. Tick-tock, the text read. Lane enforced. He put the phone face down and left. At Children's Memorial, the morning had made a different kind of noise. Rosie signed discharge papers while Noah traced his finger along the cartoon fish on the wall. She thanked the nurse, adjusted a backpack, and felt the phone buzz in the pocket of a jacket she'd bought second-hand and loved for being invisible. A reporter had left a voicemail, using a friendly voice to ask unfriendly questions. A neighbor had texted a link she didn't open. The unknown number had sent a grainy photo of her and Logan in a hospital corridor last night, taken from somewhere behind a vending machine. Caption, cute. She stood in the parking lot a long minute with her eyes closed and the sun honest on her face and decided. At home, she moved like a woman who'd done this before. Laundry in a black duffel, Noah's 2 favorite shirts, the toothbrush with the blue rocket, his weighted blanket rolled like a body she could carry, hard drives from a tin under the sink, the envelope with cash she hated needing. Noah stacked dinosaurs into a line facing the door. Road trip, he asked, hopeful and scared at once. A little one, she said, to somewhere quiet. Does quiet have robot rain? Sometimes, she said, swallowing. She texted Mariana, please tell Mr. Griffin Noah's okay, then turned her phone off. Logan drove hard and didn't remember the lights he ran. He took the curve into Pilsen too fast, braked like penance, and jogged up Rosie's front steps with suspension paperwork still warm in his jacket. She opened before he knocked twice. She hadn't been crying. She looked like a tide that had already decided which way to go. They suspended me, he said. I know, she said. It was always one of the options. They did it because I wouldn't fire you. Then thank you, she said. I'm not proud, he said. I'm angry, and I'm not here to be noble. Let me fight. You can't fight a rumor with a sword, she said. You bleed and it drinks. Stay, he said. Let me stand next to you. You don't have to do this alone. She glanced back at the duffel by the couch. Noah sat tying his shoes with the concentration of a scientist. I do, she said. Because you think you're standing next to me, but the story keeps putting you in front. That's not your fault, it's gravity. I can change the gravity, he said. You can't, she said, and smiled the saddest smile. But you tried, that matters. He stepped closer. Where will you go? Somewhere where reporters don't pronounce my name right, she said. Portland, maybe Denver, nothing permanent. Let me help, he said, hating the way the sentence sounded even as it left him. You can, she said, by letting me walk out the door without owing you a debt that will come due in ways neither of us can predict. Rosie, she touched his sleeve, a brief human permission. Logan, listen to me. I have a son who needs routine more than he needs a rooftop wedding. You have a company that needs a spine more than it needs a savior. If I stay, they break you to break me. If I go, maybe you get to keep your hands on the wheel long enough to change where the road goes. It's my road, he said, angry and helpless. I can wreck it myself. And I won't be the wrecking bar they use, she said. The hallway filled with Noah's small voice. Mom, do we bring the dinosaurs or do they guard the house? They guard, she called back. They're very brave. They stood looking at each other while a city wrote an ending it hadn't earned. I love you, Logan said before he could test the words on safer air. I know, she said, not unkindly. That's why I'm leaving. She closed the door gently, the way you do when someone is still sleeping in the next room. Logan took the step back a man takes when he's been hit by something he can't see. He stood on the porch with a pocket full of suspension and an ache that felt like a map. His phone buzzed again, the unknown number working like a metronome. Next time we don't use paperwork, it read. Accidents happen. He looked at the door, at the street, at the text like a fuse. His thumb hovered over 911, then slid instead to Mariana. Find me every file we have on Meridian, he said when she picked up. Old bids, rejected deals, any email that smells like bleach, and call Richard. Tell him if anything happens to Rosie or Noah, I will turn this building inside out until we find the one who lit the match. He hung up, the porch steps groaning under the weight of a decision he hadn't made yet, and the street held its breath as if it knew what morning was bringing. Rosie had packed in neat stacks, Noah's 2 favorite t-shirts, the weighted blanket, a zip bag of meds labeled in the tidy printing of a mother who has learned to speak hospital, then fallen asleep on the couch for an hour that felt like 5 minutes. Dawn turned the blinds into piano keys. Someone knocked. Not a neighbor's tap, not a reporter's nervous rap. 3 steady beats. The kind that arrives with paperwork. She eased the chain, kept the door on the latch. 2 people stood on the stoop in windbreakers too plain to be anything but official. A woman, hair pulled back, eyes that didn't bounce. A tall man with a folder tucked under his arm. "MS, Monroe," the woman asked, voice like a level. "Agent Chen, this is Agent Davis, Federal Bureau of Investigation." Rosie's fingers found the latch on instinct and did not move it. "Is this about the article?" "It's about Meridian Global," Davis said, showing the badge an emotion that had muscle memory behind it. "We have a subpoena for your testimony." The word landed with the weight of an old life. Rosie opened the door. "Noah's asleep," she said softly. "Keep your voices lower than fear." They stepped into the small living room like people who had learned to make themselves small when they needed to. Chen set a manila envelope on the table. "We've been running a financial crimes investigation since late last year," she said. "Your internal complaints in 2018 match patterns we're now seeing across jurisdictions." "I filed those complaints into a shredder," Rosie said. "Meridian fed the machine." Chen nodded. "They tried. But paper leaves ghosts." She glanced at Davis. He lifted the lid on a banker's box she hadn't noticed until that second. Inside, plastic sleeves, flash drives, a stack of printed emails rubber-banded in 3s, a spiral notebook with a coffee ring like a target. Rosie didn't move. "What is this?" "Recovered materials from your old D.C. building," Davis said. "Landlord turned over a box marked Monroe last month. Found during a renovation. He thought you'd come back." "I hid copies in the attic," Rosie heard herself say, as if she were listening to someone else confess. "I was pregnant and terrified and I buried them like bad teeth." Chen slid a single page across the coffee table. "We cross-checked file hashes," she said. "They verify against emails currently in our warrants. Your translations, your annotations, internal approvals with executives' names. It's not everything, it's enough." Enough. The word loosened something at the back of Rosie's throat. Enough to be believed, enough to be hunted. "What about retaliation?" she asked. "They've already started. My street had a camera lens last night." "We're aware of chatter," Davis said. "We'll have a car on your block today. If you prefer a safe location, we can place you and your son at a hotel under an alias until after you testify." "Testify?" Rosie repeated, tasting it. "When?" "Tomorrow morning." Chen said, "Preliminaries before the grand jury. There will be press. We'll do what we can." Rosie stared past them at the toys standing guard on the bookshelf, dinosaurs facing the door, a battered brontosaurus with one glued leg. Noah called it the brave one. She could feel the shape of his body asleep down the hall, the rise and fall that had taught her the metronome of living. "If I say no?" she asked. "It's not a request," Davis said, gentler than the sentence warranted. He slid the subpoena toward her. Her name sat on it like a bell waiting to be struck. Rosie signed receipt with a hand steadier than she expected. She had learned, after all, how to hold a pen in rooms that meant her trouble. "Pack light," Chen said. "Carry what you need for 2 nights. We'll take it from there." Rosie nodded. "Noah's therapy bag," she said. "He needs routine to remember which way is up." "We'll make space for his routine," Chen said. "You're not the only witness with a life to carry." When the agent stepped onto the porch, the morning had sharpened. The street looked briefly like a place where people just went to work. Rosie stood with the subpoena slipping against the sweat of her palm and let herself remember the woman she had been before Meridian airports, conference rooms with microphones, the ache of headphones, the quiet thrill of getting someone else's meaning exactly right. She went to wake Noah. "Buddy," she whispered, smoothing his hair. "We're going to a hotel." "Vacation." His eyes fluttered open, hopeful. "Sort of," she said. "There will be robot rain." He grinned, trusting her more than any future could. Her phone, face down, hummed once on the table. She turned it over. "Logan." The screen filled with a short message, unmarinated in punctuation. "I'm here if you want me there." She typed, "Thank you," then erased it. Typed, "Don't," erased that too. In the end, she sent nothing and powered the phone off. She could not carry his voice into this. In an unguarded corner of herself, she pictured him anyway, standing at a window with his tie undone. City turning his reflection into someone he recognized, and didn't, his suspension letter a folded blade in his pocket. This was the first fight he couldn't buy his way into. The knowledge made her heart lurch like a car that shifts gears without permission. Agent Chen returned to the doorway with a paper cup carrier and a bag that smelled like toast. "One more thing," she said, setting the coffee down. From the banker's box, she drew a thin folder, its cover sleeved in clear plastic. "We don't show this to scare you. We show you so you understand what you're walking through." Inside, a printout, an email header. The sender a burner domain with an extra letter, the kind of tactic cowards use. The subject line was plain and ugly, heavy as a brick. "Make you disappear." Rosie didn't flinch. She had already disappeared once. She looked up at Chen, at Davis behind her shoulder, at the sliver of morning turning her floor into a stripe. "I'm done hiding," she said. Chen nodded. "Then let's go be seen." Rosie grabbed the brave brontosaurus and slid it into Noah's backpack, tucked the weighted blanket under her arm, and stepped over the threshold with her evidence, her boy, and the one thing Meridian had never managed to dilute, her name. They put her in a windowless room with coffee that tasted like strategy. Agent Chen straightened a stack of exhibits. Agent Davis adjusted the little microphone that would carry Rosie's voice farther than she had ever wanted it to go. The brave brontosaurus sat on the table, looking ridiculous and necessary. "You can hold it," Chen said, "or think about holding it, whatever keeps the ground from tilting." Rosie smoothed the dinosaur's plastic back, then set it where she could see it. "I don't shake on microphones," she said, surprised to find it true. "I shake afterward." Davis smiled like a man who'd seen both kinds of shaking. "We'll be here for afterward." When they brought her down the hall, courthouse sounded like polished shoes and whispered curiosity. The hearing room was packed. Press badges, suits that graded themselves, a row of faces trying not to be a row of faces. A camera's red light winked. Somewhere in the country, someone in a break room turned up the volume. The prosecutor, a woman with a voice like good glass, said her name into the record. "MS. Monroe, did you work for Meridian Global between 2015 and 2018? "Yes, in what capacity?" "Senior translator and interpreter for international negotiations. Category A, clearances on certain contracts. And during that employment, did you become aware of irregularities?" Rosie folded her hands, the way she had learned to when men who had never asked for directions told her she was lost. "Yes, patterns consistent with money laundering. Shell entities, mirrored invoices, purchase orders at implausible prices routed through tax havens, repetition across regions with identical phrasing in multiple languages." The prosecutor nodded to the clerk, a screen lit with an email thread. The two N from fields were a mosaic of names. The subject line was bland enough to hide a body. "Is this one of the communications you preserved?" "It is," Rosie said. "Note the phrasing. Ensure the ballast is consistent." Ballast is not standard language in procurement. It is Meridian slang for disguised funds. "How do you know that?" "I was in the room when they invented the euphemism," she said. "They joked about boats. It was clever so no one would feel dirty." Laughter, quick and wrong, fluttered at the room's edges and died under a cough. The prosecutor clicked to a second exhibit, a contract in Basque, a familiar hush in Rosie's bones. "You translated this document." "I did," she said. "It purports to be a $50 million transfer for industrial equipment to a Cayman entity called Baltic Ventures. The address is a P.O. box. The equipment does not exist. The clause on delivery terms references an internal Meridian memo rather than any customs code. It's like a forged confession. They couldn't help bragging. And what did you do when you found this?" "Went to my supervisor, then to his, then to legal. Each time the room made me smaller." The prosecutor's face did something that wasn't quite sympathy. "Did anyone advise you to stop?" "Yes, stay in your lane, Rosie. We value your passion, Rosie. Be a team player." "Rosie, when those didn't work, someone advised me via voicemail that people who make noise sometimes disappear." "Did you preserve that voicemail?" "I did." The speakers filled with a man's cheap courage. "You should stop making up stories, Rosie. People get tired of you. People go missing. Sometimes the wrong person gets tired first." A low noise moved through the room, like a stallion making a decision. The judge banged once. Even the gavel sounded implicated. "Do you recognize the voice?" the prosecutor asked. "I recognize the cadence," Rosie said. "The vocabulary, the false intimacy of using my name like a threat." "Your Honor, we offer Exhibit 41, the prosecutor said, "and proceed to the email cache previously authenticated, Exhibits 42 through 93. They stepped through it, dates, signatures, bank transfers with round numbers that did not round to anything clean. Her own annotations in the margins, stubborn handwriting that had refused to accept the math of corruption. Each document laid on the table seemed to take weight from her shoulders and distribute it to the room. Cross-examination came with teeth. Meridian's lawyer wore a navy suit that made him look like an apology you couldn't quite accept. "Ms. Monroe," he said, smiling as if to show he wasn't a threat. "You were terminated from Meridian for performance concerns, correct?" "No," she said. "I was terminated for being inconvenient." "Is it true you had interpersonal conflicts with your supervisor?" "It is true that men don't enjoy being corrected in 2 languages at once." A few chuckles. The judge didn't bother with the gavel this time. He looked like he wanted the laugh too. "You preserved company documents without authorization." "I preserved evidence of crimes," she said. "Authorization was revoked when they tried to make me part of them." "Your evidence was thrown out in a prior case," he said, warming to his own narrative. "Handled improperly by a lawyer who stopped returning my calls," she said, the old grief trimmed to bone. The evidence itself did not change. He switched tacks. "Ms. Monroe, are you currently employed by the CEO of Griffin Imports?" "I am employed by Griffin Imports, yes." "Isn't it true that your relationship with Mr. Griffin may color your testimony today?" She looked at him the way you look at a man who picks up the wrong tool and calls it a fix. "Truth colors my testimony," she said. "If anything else is in the paint, that's on you." The prosecutor left her there. The judge adjourned for a recess. Reporters stood on their toes to see which door she would use. She chose the one with Chen behind it. In a small room with beige walls with the texture of unsalted crackers, Rosie finally shook. Chen touched her elbow. "Breathe," she said. "You dismantled a machine on national television." Rosie leaned against the table. The brave brontosaurus looked back at her with its stupid, brave face. "You ever get the feeling you've been underwater for so long that breathing hurts?" "All the time," Chen said. "Hurts mean lungs work." When they reconvened, it went faster. The judge moved like a man with other things to do. The record took what it needed. By noon, the world had an opinion. They whisked her out a side door into a car with windows that cut the shouts into tin. Outside, a woman held up a sign that said "Believe translators." Inside, Rosie held the dinosaur and remembered the first time she had put on a headset at 22 and felt like she'd plugged into the current of the world. In Logan's apartment, the TV volume was up too high, the room too quiet. He stood in a shirt he hadn't ironed, tie loose, suspension let her face down on the coffee table like a dare. When Rosie's voice filled the living room, a voice he had only heard in rooms bigger than either of them, he stopped moving. The camera loved her integrity in a way that made him both proud and furious. "She did it," Mariana texted, and then, "Turn on Channel 5. He already had. At 1:14 p.m., Meridian's interim CEO walked to a lectern that had seen better weeks. He read from a statement as if the words had been forced into him one at a time. "Meridian Global acknowledges that serious mistakes were made in our handling of concerns raised by Ms. Rosalie Monroe in 2018. We apologize for the impact our actions had on her career and safety. We are cooperating fully with federal authorities and creating a fund to compensate Ms. Monroe for damages suffered." Logan sat down hard. Coffee splashed his wrist and he didn't feel the heat. On split screen, the Chiron turned cautious. "Meridian apologizes, whistleblower vindicated." His phone rang. Richard's name glowed, the old friend version, not the COO mask. "We were wrong." Richard said, no throat clearing. "The board met. Your suspension's lifted. We need you back." "Clients calling?" Logan asked and hated that he sounded amused. "They will," Richard said. "They want to know where we stand." "With her," Logan said. "With her," Richard repeated, and the echo sounded like a test he intended to pass this time. "Also, James thinks we should consider bringing her on publicly. Optics are." "Don't say optics," Logan said. "Truth and I'll come in." There was a pause. "Truth," Richard said, quiet. "Come in." Logan hung up. He did not smile. He dialed Rosie and got a federal switchboard. He left a message that had too many verbs. "Proud, here, ready." He was halfway to the bedroom for a jacket when his phone buzzed again. Unknown number, the same chill handwriting. "Congrats on the TV," it read. "Check the parking level under the Van Buren garage. 12:47 p.m. today." A photo loaded, a grainy frame from a security camera. 2 men in the far corner of a dim garage, the kind you forget on purpose. One in a navy suit, face turned just enough to recognize James Morrison. The other's profile was a darker blur, Meridian Counsel, if Logan had to bet his reinstated job. Between them, an envelope changing hands with the ginger care of men who know what paper can do. The text that followed was shorter. "Ask him what he did with the money. He didn't bring flowers, he brought paper." Director of International Relations, Logan said, setting a draft contract on the hotel desk between her and the Lake Michigan view. $200,000 to start, full benefits, top-tier health plan for you and Noah. Flex hours. Work from home when you need it. Team is yours to build. And he tapped a paragraph in the middle. This. She read aloud slow. No public use of employee's image or personal story for marketing, PR, or investor communications without explicit written consent. Her mouth tilted. You learned a new language. I'm trying, he said. She kept going. No reporting relationship that creates a conflict of interest with the CEO. Performance reviews by a third-party executive panel. Cause defined narrowly. Retaliation protections. She set the pages down. This is the first job offer I've seen that doesn't feel like a leash. Then take it, he said. On your terms. She looked past him to Noah, sprawled on the bed with the brave brontosaurus and an apple, counting to himself like people count steps between two safe places. On my terms, she said. And one more, if this ever gets fuzzy, us work the lines I walk. No TV speeches, no pleading in boardrooms, no guilt. He nodded. If you walk, it's on your feet, not my mouth. Then we have a deal, she said and extended her hand. They shook like strangers, making a clean start. Her office on 30 had a corner of lake and an industrial plant of a desk. Mariana had stocked the shelves with dictionaries, French, Japanese, Mandarin, Basque, as if you could fend off a building's old habits with spines. A sensory kit sat in the corner, noise-canceling headphones, a weighted lap pad, a basket of squishy toys. For Noah, Mariana said, awkward and proud. Carmen in daycare knows visuals. There's a quiet room we call the cloud. Robot rain. Noah asked, peeking in. Sometimes, Carmen said, appearing like a person with a map. We even have a tiny fan that makes thunder if you ask nicely. Noah followed her with all the skepticism of a small scientist and all the trust of a boy who'd survived a night of machines. Rosie watched them go, then sat in the chair with her nameplate, simple, black, and startling, and let the lake talk to her for a single breath. At 10, the German buyers arrived with 3 men in suits that had opinions about punctuality. James, face smoothed of public resentment, took a chair that wasn't quite at the head of the table. The youngest translator, Evan, smirked when Rosie slid a pad in front of her. From mop to manager, he muttered under his breath. From guessing to listening, she said without looking at him. The lead buyer asked about documentary credits and a clause that had tripped every prior call. Rosie nodded once, answered in German that ran clean as a river over the right stones, and shifted to English for her own team. He wants the letter of credit to specify UCP 600 compliance for partial shipments. Last draft didn't. Also, he needs a certificate of origin signed by the chamber, not by us. Evan's pen hovered, then started moving. A second buyer threw in a side question about force majeure. Rosie didn't blink. He means epidemics and government shutdowns, she said. Not acts of God that last forever. We'll draft a 60-day review. The meeting signed itself. When they left, the room felt bigger. In the afternoon, a Japanese client arrived with papers too thick for Friday. James started and stalled at an old law reference. Rosie took it gently. He's not invoking the WTO redraft, she said. He's invoking the 1987 import legislation on scrap metal restrictions. We have to certify post-consumer content at 30%. If we're short, we'll get stuck at Narita and pay storage. How did you, James began, and then stopped because asking would make something new between them. Because I read, she said. Because that's what this job is. By 5, the jokes in the building had changed shape. The ones you could hear anyway. People still watched her, some with admiration they were not brave enough to say out loud, some with the special irritation reserved for competence that doesn't ask permission, but they stopped asking if she belonged. Work had a way of deciding that faster than gossip. Logan appeared in her doorway like a man who'd learned to knock on rooms he used to own. How was day one? Chairs were sat in. Papers were signed. Accuracy briefly outperformed narrative, she said. In this economy, that's a miracle. He gave a small, honest grin. Dinner to celebrate. Boundaries, she said, pointing to the contract on her desk. Coffee, he tried. In the morning, from the machine that doesn't taste like regret. She pretended to consider. Black, 1 sugar, no speeches. No speeches, he promised. Maybe a joke. Don't push it, Logan. He left her to the lake, and the soft hum of a building evening. Across the hall, James closed his office door with the hush of someone who prefers carpets to witnesses. He opened his personal email, never company for certain communications, and found a new message from an address that looked like a typo. Subject, your Black River account. He stared, then clicked, because all men who think they've built a secret eventually need to see who else has found it. The body was short enough to be dangerous. We see the transfers. 7,713 Right Arrow Black Gulls LLC Right Arrow Sterling Services. Memo lines, ballast. Attachments didn't care how much your suit cost. PDFs of wire logs, a screenshot of a banking portal with his hand in the corner like a forensic thumbprint, a spreadsheet color-coded in a palette no one had chosen for kindness. His mouth dried. He scrolled, slower and then faster. The earliest transfer dated back months before Sterling Services won the janitorial contract, back when Sterling had been a rumor James had rehearsed into efficiency. The numbers weren't big enough to be spectacular, they were just steady enough to be true. A second email landed on top of the first like a hammer. Subject, audit begins Monday. Body, external, independent, you'll want a story. He swiveled toward the glass where the lake was pretending to be calm, where a city that forgave nothing glittered like a ledger. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. Ask him what he did with the money. James looked at the door. At the desk drawer where a burner lived, at the calendar on his screen. A business trip to Paris blinked back. International Trade Conference. 2 weeks. Delegations. Bars where men like him met men like him and called it networking. He hit delete. Then he hit reply, hands steadier than his breath. We should talk, he typed to a contact saved under a name that meant nothing. Paris, same bar, bring your counsel. He closed the laptop, pressed his palms against the wood until the grain left marks, and told himself that secrets were just stories you hadn't had to tell yet. Outside, the building lights came on one by one, as if the city were an audience and the stage was finally ready. The George F. in Paris smelled like lilies and conspiracies. A bellman rolled 2 suitcases over carpet that could keep a secret. Logan took the elevator 2 floors above Rosie because the contract said boundaries, and because he had finally learned to read. 7 a.m. in the lobby, he texted. Black coffee, no speeches. Black coffee, 1 sugar, she replied. No speeches, no sudden performances. At the convention center, the air tasted like badge plastic and espresso. Flags haloed the atrium, each booth a minor kingdom with its own lighting and lies. Rosie clipped on her visitor tag and turned into the version of herself that carried a room by making it easy for everyone else to breathe. Japan first. 2 executives in navy suits bowed at a perfect angle and asked in careful English whether Griffin could guarantee post-consumer content thresholds within a rolling 90 days if port congestion worsened. The official translator tried to turn it into a press release. Rosie tilted slightly toward the clients, answering in Japanese with the cadence of someone who respected what was being asked. He's not asking if we can, she told Logan in English, low. He's asking if we'll put the penalty for missing it on our side instead of his. He'll accept 30% PC content with a make-good clause if the port delays extend past 60 days. Also, he wants to know if you actually read the last clause yourself. Logan didn't flinch. Tell him yes, and that I'll initial that clause personally. A flicker of surprise crossed the buyer's face, then approval. Papers moved. Stamps hit ink. Rosie wrote 1 neat note. Make good equals our storage cost. A Chinese delegation followed, 3 men and a woman who smiled with only her eyes. Guangxi hung in the air like fabric softener. The junior interpreter smoothed a long sentence into something with no edges. He complimented our reputation and says the other party's offer is flexible, the interpreter offered. Rosie's head turned by a degree. He said the other party's offer is insulting, but he won't say that in front of you. He's asking if we know how to control our subcontractors' mouths. Tell him we do. Tell him I fire people for sloppy language before I fire them for sloppy tables. The woman across the table actually laughed, hand over lips. The men hid smiles like children in church. At the end, business cards changed hands with the weight of small treaties. Logan watched Rosie bow just right and thought, not for the first time, how competence looked like grace if you weren't threatened by it. France then. A buyer who kept the knot of his tie too tight asked for Incoterms that would shift risk to the side of the ocean with the smaller lawyers. He's pushing DDP, Rosie said, but he'll accept CPT if you add a line about customs clearance responsibility at destination. He wants to go home telling his boss he made you responsible for the scary part. Let him have the sentence. We'll still control the shipment. By noon, she had moved through 3 languages without switching pens. The young translator Evan stopped smirking and started listening. James Morrison texted once, booth B12 at 3, then didn't answer when Logan replied, bring the Narita file. Maybe the time change made cowards braver. At lunch, they found a cafe a block off the Seine where the chairs wobbled and the butter refused to apologize. They ate sandwiches that stained their fingers and drank water that tasted like someone else's childhood. A couple argued beautifully at the next table, then kissed like a treaty. You look different here, Logan said. Less braced. In Paris, she said, tearing bread. Everyone assumes you know something. In Chicago, everyone assumes you don't, unless you invoice them for it. Still invoice, he said. Good, she smiled into her glass. For a moment, the street turned soft at the edges, like a film that remembers you at 20 and lets you see it. He wanted to ask about Brussels again, the wet wool conference hall, the first time she wore a headset and felt plugged into the current. Instead, he asked, "Have you forgiven me?" "For what?" she said, neutral. "The sidewalk," he said, "the reflex." "I forgave you the day you learned to knock," she said, "when you started asking questions you didn't already have answers to." "And Meridian?" he asked, "have you forgiven them?" She watched a barge move under the bridge like a sentence underlining itself. "Forgiveness is a word you give yourself when you're tired of bleeding," she said. "What I feel isn't that. It's relief that I don't have to spend my life carrying their weight." He nodded. The wind lifted a napkin and let it go. The afternoon panel on the future of global trade had men on a dais and a moderator who believed microphones could absolve. Logan took his place at the far end and decided not to perform. "At Griffin," he said into the room, "we spent this year learning that success measured in dollars can collapse in a day if the people making the money don't feel safe telling the truth. We adjusted our balance sheet to include integrity. It's not measurable and it's non-negotiable. You can call that idealism, I call it insurance." A few heads turned. One man scowled as if profit had feelings. Rosie watched from the third row with a pen in her hand she didn't need. Her chest did a small, private thing. That night, the conference threw a gala to make contracts feel romantic. The ballroom shimmered in a way that made you forgive it for existing. Logan wore a tuxedo he didn't feel like apologizing for. Rosie wore navy that made the room dim a shade to see her better. Music did the kind of math that rounds people together. "Colleagues can dance," Logan said at the edge of the floor. "Professionally," she said. "They moved like people memorizing a border." He kept his hand respectfully where the contract could see it. She laughed once, not loud, not for show, the kind of laugh you only notice if you're watching her mouth. They talked about nothing. They didn't use the words they were both carrying. Halfway through the song, Logan's phone vibrated in his jacket like a heart deciding to bolt. He let it ring, then another, then surrendered to the third. Unknown number, the old handwriting. "Enjoy the party," it read. "Check your messages." A photo appeared. Grainy, low light, timestamped 20 minutes ago. A bar with checkered tile he recognized from the hotel's lobby level. James Morrison at a small round table, face turned just enough for identification, a drink untouched in front of him. Opposite him, a man with the kind of haircut Meridian Council wore, flanked by a second man whose shoulders looked like they did other men's errands. On the table, an envelope half slid from a briefcase. James's hand on it. Another frame followed, the envelope being tucked under the Meridian man's menu as if it were a garnish. Second text, "Ask him about Black River." Logan felt heat crawl his spine before the word even finished forming in his head. He looked over Rosie's shoulder toward the lobby bar through a scrim of hanging glass and bodies dressed like decisions. He could swear he saw the back of James's suit moving toward the hallway that led to the private elevators. "Something wrong?" Rosie asked, very quietly. He forced his jaw to unclench. "Just work. Work that shakes your hands," she said, eyes dropping to where his fist had closed around his phone. He loosened it. "I'll be a minute." "Go," she said, "catch your ghost." He cut through the ballroom, past a table where a diplomat was explaining to a banker why the word partnership has different meanings in different countries. The lobby bar smelled like wood and American whiskey. James was gone. The Meridian Council's chair sat empty, a water ring on the black table like an accusation. Logan stood there, phone stacked in his pocket like choices, and felt the old, useless anger that money had taught him to mistake for power. He texted Richard, "Find out where James is staying. Now." He forwarded the photos to legal with the line, "Independent audit begins Monday. Move it up." He started a draft message to the unknown number, "Who are you?" and deleted it. On his way back into the ballroom, he nearly collided with Evan, the young translator who was flushed and proud and a little unsteady. "Director Monroe says we need to amend the Japanese clause," Evan blurted. "I didn't catch the nuance about storage fees." "She did, of course she did. She saved me. Don't tell her I said that." "I won't," Logan said. "I'll tell her she saved the company." He found Rosie by the balcony doors, looking out at the Eiffel Tower being its impolite, luminous self. "You always find the highest light," he said, breath steady now. "I grew up in small apartments," she said. "You learn to claim windows." He handed her a glass of water, felt the music pull him toward things he wasn't allowed to ask for. He chose the safer question. "Do you ever get tired of being right?" "All the time," she said, "but it keeps people alive." From inside the pocket of his jacket, his phone thudded once more. Another message. Same unknown number, no photograph this time. Only 4 words, "He's not working alone." Logan kept his face smooth the way he'd learned to when deals went left. Inside, a decision slid into place, quiet as a switch. "Walk with me?" he asked. "Where? Somewhere I can hear myself making a mistake or not." They stepped onto the terrace. Paris turned itself up. Far below, a siren rode a straight line through a crooked city. Rosie wrapped her arms around herself against a clean wind that didn't care about anyone's plans. "I need you Monday," Logan said. "Not to translate, to witness. We're going to open drawers and ask names and hurt people who deserve it. You'll be tempted to become the symbol again. I don't want that for you. I want you in the room to tell me when I've forgotten the difference between justice and vengeance." "That's heavy for Gala," she said, but she didn't laugh it off. "Everything is heavy," he said. "We just pretend it's sequins." She watched him for a long beat. "I'll be there," she said, "on one condition." "Name it." "We keep work as work," she said. "When it's over, we go back to our windows. No speeches in ballrooms, no mistakes on balconies." He looked at her hands on the railing. He looked at the tower stabbing the night like an obvious metaphor. He nodded. "Deal." Behind them, applause sputtered for someone on a microphone with a voice built for fundraising. Below them, a city with a long memory carried a secret from one bar to another. Inside Logan's pocket, the phone stayed blessedly still. For half a minute, it was just them and a night that didn't yet know what it owed them. Down in the lobby, an envelope slid into the inside pocket of a navy jacket. Up on the terrace, Rosie's hair lifted in a gust that made her shiver. Logan reached, stopped, and let the wind put it down again. They flew home on separate rows and the same resolve. By Monday, a war room lived in Conference C. A whiteboard with dates like vertebrae, a banker's box of printouts, legal in rolled sleeves, IT imaging laptops the way crime shows taught them. A sign on the door read simply, "Audit." "Independent," Rosie said, standing at the threshold. "No one from accounting in the room, chain of custody on every file. We don't get righteous and sloppy at the same time." Logan nodded to the outside firm he'd called at 3 a.m., Halberd Forensics. The lead said, tapping blue tape over a laptop camera. "We'll mirror James's machine and follow the money." "Not just James," Rosie added. "Sterling Services, any vendor tied to outsourcing for facilities. Cross-reference with bid language and time stamps." Halberd's people moved like locksmiths. IT slid a signed consent across the table for devices the company owned. HR slid access logs. Legal slid a nervous smile that said, "I'm on your side as long as sides exist." Rosie watched the evidence land in labeled trays and felt, for the first time in a long time, like the room itself was on the right side of her. At 10, Logan texted James, "My office. Now." Richard slipped in and took a chair along the wall, looking like a man who had decided which friend he needed to be. James arrived with the posture of someone who still trusted carpets. "Which fire are we pretending to put out?" he asked, aiming for board and hitting brittle. "The one under your desk," Logan said, sliding 2 printed emails across the table. Subject lines, "Your Black River account and audit begins Monday." James's eyes flicked. "Anonymous emails aren't evidence." "The screenshots are," Richard said, voice flat. "Wire logs from your 7713 account to Black Gulls LLC, then to Sterling Services. Memo line ballast, that word ring any bells?" James's mouth made the shape of a chuckle and didn't deliver the sound. "Retainers, standard, I consult. On bids you later approve?" Logan asked. "On vendors you were already paying." James set his jaw. "This is beneath you." "What's beneath me is drowning my company in your ballast," Logan said, "and using my employee as cover." James spread his hands. "You're seeing patterns because you want to see them." Rosie stepped forward. "No, we see patterns because you repeated yourself. The RFP language for Sterling matches Sterling's original pitch, down to a comma splice. You ghost-wrote a competition you'd already paid to win." James finally turned to her, heat in his eyes. "You've been here 5 minutes and climbed into a chair you didn't earn." "I earn everything twice," she said evenly. "Once by doing it, twice by surviving men who hate that I did." He looked away first. "You going to arrest me with a dictionary?" he muttered. Richard leaned in. "We pulled badge logs the night the article dropped," he said. "You were on 35 at 9:12 p.m., 10 minutes before a reporter called Logan and quoted a senior leader. HR doesn't leak, Sandra was home with her kids, so who?" James looked almost relieved to have a smaller sin to confess to. "A tip isn't a crime." "A tip becomes a crime when it's paid for by a competitor," Logan said, sliding one more sheet. "Paris, you and Meridian Council. Envelope. You still want to call it networking." James's eyes cut to the photo like it had teeth. "You had me followed." "Someone else did," Logan said. "I don't care who, I care why." Silence lengthened until it started to look like a plan. James' phone buzzed on the table. He palmed it and half turned away, forgetting the mirrored glass behind him made his face a small TV. Inking app bloomed. He typed quickly, thumb shaking. "Freeze that," Rosie said, already moving. Halberd's lead stepped in from the hall as if conjured, shot a look to IT. "We have live activity," he said. Mr. Morrison set the phone down. James didn't. Logan stood, voice quiet in a way that scared men who liked volume. James, the phone clicked against the wood. Halberd peered. Outgoing wire. 30,000 to Black Gulls LLC. Memo, containment. Scheduled for today, 1800. Who's the recipient? Richard asked. Halberd scrolled. Passed through to a private security outfit in Cicero, no website. Prior notes mention accident in lane. Rosie's stomach went cold, then hot. The texts. Next time we don't use paperwork. Containment of what? Logan asked, eyes on James. James's composure cracked like a cheap glass. You don't understand how Meridian plays, he said, too fast. They wanted you rattled, they wanted her gone. I packaged it. Leak here, purge there, outsource was easy, the rest just moves. Rosie heard her own breath, hated that it sounded like a clock. The rest. James dragged a hand down his face. Jesus, I didn't want blood, he said, suddenly small. It was leverage, pressure, a break-in maybe, scare her. Stage a thing. Enough that she'd leave town, you'd stop grandstanding, they'd back off. Yup, the number after the court thing. Make her disappear was their word. Whose word? Richard snapped. James shut his eyes. Meridian's fixer, the council's fixer. I don't know his real name, everyone calls him Black River like it's cute. Halberd's lead nodded to IT. We're freezing the transfer, he said. Bank's AML flagged our ping. It might hold, might not. Logan moved around the desk like the desk had offended him. He wanted to shout. He didn't. You put a target on her in our building, he said, almost wondering. You took their money and used my company like a gun rack. James threw up his hands, shaking. This is how it's done. You think nobody does this. You think your noble little speech in Paris rewired the market. This isn't the market, Logan said. This is a person, with a 7-year-old who counts thunder to stay calm. James sagged into the chair. I can undo some, he said. Call off the break-in. Return the wire. Give you everyone's names. Just don't call the cops yet. Rosie's voice could have cut glass. We call everyone, she said. Police, FBI, the press when it helps. And we do it by the book so nothing gets thrown out for being handled wrong. No hero stories, no speeches, just receipts. Richard stood. I'll get security on Rosie, he said. 2 guards, all exits now. Don't make me the headline, Rosie said, turning to the door. Make the system the headline. Copy, Richard said, already dialing. Halberd spoke to his team without looking up. Print wire confirmations. Get a preservation order for Mr. Morrison's personal accounts. Subpoena Sterling. Chain. Logan stared down at James. You'll sit in a room with a recorder and say Meridian paid me to set up a leak to discredit an employee and to contract a containment, your word, that implies violence, he said. Then you'll give us the fixer's number. James swallowed. I don't have it saved. Good, Rosie said from the doorway. Because men like that don't put their names in your phone, they put them in your nightmares. Drag it out of there. James's phone buzzed again, he flinched. Unknown number. The preview line read, 6 p.m. confirmed, west stairwell. No one breathed. Security, Richard barked into his handset. Lock down the west stairwell, now, get Rosie off 30. The overhead speaker clicked and delivered the building's most hated sentence. Attention, we are conducting a fire drill. Please proceed to the nearest stairwell. Halberd's lead swore. False pull, he said. They're forcing movement. Logan was already moving. Mariana, find her, he said into his phone. She's on 30. Get her to the core elevator. Ignore the drill, that's an order. On it, Mariana said. He could hear her running. He bolted into the hall, taking the corner so hard his shoulder skinned the wall. Somewhere below, alarms began to yelp in that bureaucratic way danger announces itself. Behind him, James sank lower, his phone face up, the 4 words pulsing like a heartbeat gone wrong. West stairwell. 6 p.m. confirmed. The alarm began its cheerful lie. This is a drill. Doors opened, heels clipped, people who'd practiced safety filed toward the stairs where danger waited. Ignore it, Logan snapped into his phone. Core elevator only. On 30, Mariana hit Rosie's doorway at a dead run. With me, she said, not breathing the word now. She took Rosie's elbow, cut left, swiped a badge that shouldn't have opened the executive lift but did. Mariana had asked IT for quiet privileges years ago and never turned them in. The doors slid shut on the sound of orderly panic. West stairwell, came Richard's voice in Rosie's other ear, harsh with adrenaline. Security posts up in 10. Do not. The elevator shuddered and stopped between floors. Rosie felt the old Meridian cold crawl up her spine. Power cut, she said. Mariana's hands were already on the panel. No, manual override, they're hurting us. She pried a plastic tab, jammed a pen into a hole no one uses unless they've been taught. The car hummed and dropped 1 floor. The doors opened to a utility corridor that smelled like electricity and dust. Left, Mariana said. Follow the robot rain. They ran. On the west stairs, a man in a work jacket held a walkie like a prayer and a zip tie like punctuation. He didn't see the first guard until the guard's forearm was in his throat and the zip tie skittered across concrete. "Lane enforced," the guard hissed. "Not today." Agent Chen strode in on that sentence like she'd heard it rehearsed. "Federal agents," she called, badge up, voice ironed flat. The man's eyes flicked to Rosie just long enough to confirm she was alive. Then he looked back down at his training and did the math wrong. Took 3 bodies and 1 textbook takedown to finish him. Davis cuffed him, steady hands, steady breath. "Cicero outfit," Chen said, checking the man's belt. "No website, a lot of cash, hello, Black Gull's money." Logan arrived on a sprint that made the hallway bend. He stopped only when he could see Rosie, and then the word he didn't say sat in his throat like prayer. "You okay?" "I'm tired of being a headline," she said, hands shaking now that she had permission. "You're not the headline," he said. "They are." Security funneled them to a small conference room with no windows and bad art. Halberd forensics lined up printed wires like a bad family tree. James Morrison sat in a chair like it might absolve him if he didn't move. Sweat had undone his gel. He looked at Chen the way men look at cliffs. "They'll trade you," Chen said, not unkindly. "Names for leniency. This is the moment you decide whether you're a villain with an arc or a footnote with handcuffs." James swallowed and handed over a number that wasn't saved under a name. "We call him Black River," he said. "He meets at the Van Buren garage, always top level. Meridian Council uses him to do the things lawyers can't bill." "How poetic," Rosie said. "He's not a river, he's a drain." By 6, the building stood down. By 8, a federal SUV took a man with a work jacket and a broken smugness out a back entrance. At 9, a warrant hit a suite on La Salle where Meridian Council kept a safe for things he swore didn't exist. Paper remembers. The news broke before midnight. CFO coordinated smear, contractor hired to intimidate whistleblower. The Chiron shouted, all caps standing in for outrage. Logan turned his phone face down. Rosie turned hers off. Noah slept, breathing even, his brave brontosaurus parked at attention beside his bed. June laid its clean light across Chicago. The rooftop of Griffin Imports looked like a garden that had trained itself to grow above glass. Guests fanned themselves with programs and tried not to cry before the vows. A string quartet played the kind of music that forgives you for your past. Logan stood at the end of an aisle that had hosted quarterly updates and one spectacularly bad product demo. His tux fit the way consequences fit earned. Richard was at his shoulder, eyes soft in a way that didn't require apologies. Mariana fluttered around like a person who had learned to embrace her role as the universe's hinge. Rosie stepped out of the elevator in a dress that made silence an entirely new instrument. She wasn't a princess. She was a person who had survived and chosen softness on purpose. Noah went first, ring pillow held like a mission. He walked with the same focus he brought to tying shoes, counting his steps under his breath. 15-16. At the front row sat 3 faces from a nightmare rewritten. David Kellerman, Sarah Chen, and Michael Rodriguez, Meridian in the version that remembered how to be human. David had a white envelope. Sarah's eyes already brimmed. "We weren't invited," David murmured when he had a moment, "but we came with receipts." "We're learning," Sarah said, voice breaking. "We have been learning, too slow, too late." Michael held out the envelope. "Additional compensation," he said, throat thick. "Signatures, their lawyers hate this, that's how we know it matters." Rosie took it, didn't open it, and nodded. "I accept your apology, you help build what comes next." Noah Solemn presented the rings. "Speech," he announced because no one had stopped him. He faced the guests and cleared his throat. "My mom is my hero," he said simply. He looked at Logan. "He is good. He knows robot rain is just the fan." After broke something tight and made room. The efficient kept it short. Vows like promises people could actually keep. Love not as rescue but as daily practice. Logan's voice went rough when he said Noah's name. Rosie's eyes went bright when she said partner. They exchanged rings. The city leaned in. "By the authority vested," the efficient began. "Wait," Logan said, turned, and looked down the aisle like a man checking a horizon. He lifted a hand for Rosie's patience, then a microphone for a different kind of vow. "At Griffin," he said, "we're signing a new charter today, not about profit, about people. We're launching a mentorship and job training program for women who have been told to stay in their lane. It will be led by Rosie. It will be funded by the contracts we would have lost without her. It will not use her as a mascot. It will use her as a compass." Applause came in a wave that felt earned, not polite. Rosie squeezed his hand once hard. "You didn't ask me," she whispered. "I know," he whispered back. "You'll fix it." "I will," she said, eyes shining. "We'll call it the Window Fund." "The Robot Rain Fund," Noah whispered loudly, and the name stuck the way true things do. "Now," the efficient said, smiling, By the authority vested in me by the state of Illinois and the witnesses who have already decided, I pronounce you." Logan didn't wait for the noun. He kissed Rosie like a man who had learned patience and then earned indulgence. The reception felt like exhale. Colleagues came up with shy congratulations, clients with forthright ones. Richard clinked a glass and apologized into a microphone without naming the sins. Sandra Walsh stood in the shadow of a fern, eyes rimmed red, and finally stepped into the light. "I sent some of those photos," she said to Logan when he wandered near. "Not the threats, the tips. Garage." Van Buren, "HR isn't supposed to spy, but we're supposed to keep people safe. I chose wrong before. I wanted one right." "You got one," he said. "Get another stay." She nodded. "I intend to." Carmen, the daycare lead, danced with Noah to a song he didn't know, counting steps out loud like a spell. Evan, the junior translator, stood by the railing grinding honesty through his teeth. "She saved my job," he confessed to nobody in particular and everybody who needed to hear it. Later, as the city tilted toward evening and the lake turned the color of good promises, Rosie and Logan found a sliver of quiet by the parapet. The wind lifted wisps of her hair and set them down again. He rested his chin on her head. She leaned back, not to be held up but to be held. "2 years ago," she said, looking out across the blocks she used to clean, "I mopped these floors and looked up at this terrace and wondered what the view felt like." "You were always the owner," he said. "I just had to learn how to see." They stood there until the last speech died and the string quartet packed its grief and joy in matching cases. When they turned to go, Mariana intercepted them with a white envelope she hadn't meant to open and had not resisted opening halfway. "This came by courier," she said. "No return address for Director Monroe." Rosie broke the seal. Inside, a brass key, old and particular, and a card from a Bilbao notary. One line handwritten in a round, careful Basque. "Gerada Bena Prezio Adu." Rosie read it once, twice, felt the old language walk through her mouth. "It's yours," she translated, the lake catching her voice, "but it has a price." "Aunt Lourdes's house," Logan said. "The river." "And what's inside?" Rosie said, turning the key in her palm, feeling its teeth. She looked up at him, something like a dare and something like a prayer sharing space in her eyes. "Spain." He smiled like a man who finally wanted the fight he couldn't buy. "Spain." Her phone buzzed where she'd forgotten it in her clutch. Unknown number, no preview. She showed him the screen. He showed her his open hand. She set the phone on his palm without reading it. Together, they watched the light blink once. Twice. "Tomorrow," she said. "Tomorrow," he agreed. They walked back into the party with the key between their fingers and a city for a witness. And somewhere, an ocean away, a house by a river, waited with its own locked story, humming behind the door.